Hi, I'm Christopher. I'm one of the co-founders of Anoma and Namada. I also used to work on a protocol called IBC before, which you might have heard of. Today I'm going to talk about Scalefree Consensus for Scalefree Money. And I know you're going to say, Christopher, you're introducing another new term. Why? Well, I will tell you why, but first... Okay, so what does this look like? You know, to me, honestly, it looks like Denver, kind of tragic, but there we go. And Denver, in fact, is on USD. The word on, so I chose to use the verb on, like on drugs. Like, it's very intentional. Like, you know, Denver is on USD, and this is pretty much like what your world on USD looks like. And then there's this word, Scalefree Money. What does it mean? Haven't told you yet. A super secret, but I'm going to argue that basically whether your world looks like this world is like a consequence of the topology of your accounting system, at least like in large part. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. But first, we must start with a history lesson. So there's this whole discipline called economics. It kind of turns out that it's like mostly wrong. There's some crazy assumptions once you start to read it, like risk-free interest rate is like a standard assumption. Like, let's just take as a standard assumption that like you can get money for free. Like, dude, did you ever go to physics? Like, okay, no. So let's go back. Let's go back to like a little town. We can all imagine a little town. We don't need to invent any fancy terms. Butcher, baker, candlestick maker. This just came into my head when I was making the presentation. I think it's actually like a rhyme from a children's song. I don't know if, is the ratio of butchers to bakers to candlestick makers usually one? Probably not, but they are all like pretty helpful things. So there's this theory that's part of the economic canon that money emerges from trying to solve the double coincidence of wants. The theory basically says that communities start out bartering. So someone, the butcher chops the meat, the baker bakes the bread, the candlestick maker makes the candlesticks, and like they just barter with each other to get the stuff which they want, and that's kind of annoying because the butcher has to find a time when he wants to cut meat, and the baker also wants to give him bread, and he wants bread, and the baker wants meat, and that seems like much less likely to randomly emerge than if you had some great kind of unit of money just to intermediate all of this so you don't need to solve double coincidence of wants. And so the economic canon postulates, I think Adam Smith particularly is the one who originated this, that this barter economy leads to money. It turns out that this, when you go read history as opposed to just your economics textbooks, this never happened. It didn't happen anywhere. A bunch of anthropologists spent a lot of time, 10 years, and PhD theses and all of these other things, looking for a barter economy that turned into money, and it just didn't happen. Because people are smarter than economists, and they did credit accounting. So credit accounting is pretty straightforward. In fact, in a small town, everyone knows each other. People do need the stuff that everyone else is producing. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't be producing it. They just don't need it all at the same time. So credit basically integrates over time. So in a simple credit economy in a town, the butcher just goes to the baker and he actually just takes the bread, right? He doesn't give the baker anything. He's not bringing meat, at least not most of the time. Maybe it's a gift sometimes, but the baker keeps track. The baker keeps a tally sheet and says, okay, well, you came on Tuesday and you came on Wednesday and you came on Thursday, and where's my meat? Something's going wrong, right? But mostly, one advantage of this accounting scheme is that it's actually kind of purposefully somewhat approximate. It doesn't need to be exact. You just need to identify, there's someone in this town who's not producing anything that anybody needs, and they keep taking too much, right? So you still want to identify gross imbalances, but you don't need to exactly track everything. The other advantage of this credit accounting is that it keeps everyone's incentives pretty aligned, because if I'm the butcher and you're the baker, I want you to be able to continue to produce bread. You want me to be able to continue to slaughter meat. It's in our best interest, just because we're in this very tight-knit community, to be understanding of things not always exactly matching up to equal, right? Because there's a lot of fluctuation. Maybe some years the harvest is better, some years your wheat fields are ruined by locusts or whatever. You could tell that I've never grown wheat, but right. So this seems great. And in particular, one thing that's great about it is that this kind of pre-modern money is actually something called scale-free. And by scale-free, I just mean that anyone can issue money. So here, the definition of money being used is just whatever it is that we are using to account, right? So I'm not saying this is not dollars. They're not bills going around, right? But when I say money, I'm talking about the accounting system. And in this pre-modern monetary system, anyone can issue credit. Basically, I issue credit by going to the baker and like taking some bread, and the baker writes something down. And that something is like the identity who's issuing credit, right? So that could be individuals, could be businesses. The town probably can like has a claim on resources if they're doing sort of whole town improvement projects, whatever, building stuff. This credit accounting is not, it's not like in a database system. There's no spreadsheet, there's no central bank, there's no like, not even probably not in these, at least the instance which I read, there wasn't really a central accounting facility. People would just compare notes sometimes, but basically like people would individually keep their own credit ledgers. The baker would keep his credit ledger, the butcher would keep his credit ledger, et cetera. So this is credit accounting. I think you can consider this a monetary system, but it's virtual. And in particular, the reason why, maybe the primary reason why we don't have this like nice system anymore is that it does not scale. This only works when everyone knows each other and everyone can kind of keep approximate track of who's taking what, who's producing what. Is this system sort of balanced? And it also requires that everyone basically needs what each other is producing, even if not at the same time, right? So as a butcher, as long as I need bread sometimes, then it's fine to me if you, the baker, come and take some of my meat sometimes. We don't need to match up in time, but we need to like have the expectation that we'll match up eventually, right? And that works when you have a very like dense network of just economic, real economic or physical economic interdependency between the participants, but not so much in the modern world where you don't at large scales. So in the modern world, we live with fiat money. Fiat money is like also credit. It's just limited to a few dozen governments who can issue it, and the rest of us plebs trade obligations with regards to those governments. This does like solve a certain sense of the scaling problem. Strangers don't need to trust each other, and they don't need to have mutual interdependency in order to have some reason to interact. They just need to trust the same fiat, and they need to trust the accuracy of the counting mechanism. But fiat has problems, and I'm going to focus on two problems. There are a lot of like preaching to the choir here, right? But why bother? I'm going to focus on two problems which I think are perhaps somewhat unemphasized. It's not just that like governments do the wrong thing or something. In my understanding, the two principal problems with fiat are that centralization of trust results in a loss of fault tolerance. And I actually think here the second and third and fourth, et cetera, order effects are worse than the first order effects. The really bad thing about the centralization of fiat issuance is not just that like I disagree with what the government spends money on. It's that the competition over that money supply generates large public externalities, which are usually negative because people are like, need to come up with good propaganda to get the public to elect their side, or to like even before elections to not riot, whatever. And that, especially when amplified by digital technology and sort of the modern complexity, has large usually negative consequences for public sense making. But the other fatal flaw of fiat that I want to talk about is a pretty different one, and I think it's one that you might not think about so immediately because it's not in the political discussion sphere. And that's that fiat relies on measurement in the present. So there's a big difference between transacting with kind of personal credit money and transacting with fiat, in that when you transact with fiat, you're only trading obligations to the government. You're actually not like, this is a kind of decontextualized exchange. So even when, sometimes maybe you're trading with, you're paying someone who you don't know, but sometimes you're paying someone who you know, right? But even when you're paying someone when you use fiat, you calculate exactly what it is that you owe the other person or what it is that they owe you, so that you can walk away from every interaction and basically be happy with that, right? Whereas when you're dealing in more personal credit denominations of individuals or organizations, the parties walk away having some kind of mutual interest in each other's success, right? If I hold government debt and I am like responsible for mentoring you, I have no real reason to care if I succeed at doing that, because I still have the same government debt, right? But if I hold your credit and I'm mentoring you, then I want to do a good job, because if I do a good job, your credit, which I now hold, is going to be valuable to me in the future, because other people will want, what it is that you're now able to do, right? So this reliance on measurement in the present, I think works fine for like physical stuff that basically mostly exists in the present, like sandwiches, and it just doesn't work so well for things, the value of which is mostly in the future, like education. So what is this concept, scale-free money, and what would it look like? A world of scale-free money is one where we kind of like try to take this thing that's happening in the village where everyone is issuing credit and figure out some way to like solve the scaling problem, right? So everyone can issue money wherever they want. Basically, there's no preference as to, so you can think of fiat as like a preference in a monetary system design for only institutions at very large scales being able to issue money, right? Independent of what, I think like the structural analysis is more important than the particular analysis. So independent of like what the governments are large. That's like what distinguishes them. They're large and typically they have a monopoly on physical force. But in a fiat system, only those large institutions can issue money. Whereas in a scale-free monetary system, everyone can issue money. So individuals can issue money. Individuals can issue like multiple denominations of money. There's different. Friend groups can issue money. Organizations can issue money. Governments can issue money. Now these are different. This is not like UBI. These are different denominations of money. So then the challenge is, how do you in a world where we're all using different denominations of money, we don't actually agree on anything. We just have like 5 bajillion different denominations of money. So how do we match that up? And that's basically what I'll spend the remainder of the presentation on. But the base assumption, if you try and design a system this way, is that everyone can issue money. You just use cryptographic signatures or something, and voila, money, right? So in particular, also, I want to note that I'm using the word money, and money is a very loaded word. It's possibly like the most loaded word in the English language at this point. And loaded words are dangerous things, but money in this system, it starts to become something else. So, I would argue that money kind of already is a distributed voting scheme. It's just a terrible one, but we're getting the results of running this terrible voting scheme. Scale-free money tries to change how the voting scheme works. In particular, it changes it in a way that sort of walks a tightrope between scarcity and abundance. So we do want probably an accounting system that has the ability to track things which are physically scarce, because we have some physically scarce resources that are not, not everything is a public good. And we need some amount of scarcity to be able to track that. On the other hand, we have a lot of things which are not scarce resources, and if we optimize only for tracking scarce resources, we're probably only going to succeed at coordinating those, which is roughly what we see. Scale-free money is scarce from the perspective of an individual denomination. There's still a finite amount of my credit, right, whatever it is that I've issued. But it is not scarce in terms of number of denominations. So you can always create a new denomination of money, or combine with a different friend and choose to create your temporary DAO, and that can start to issue money, right? So there is kind of a distinction there in the scarcity of the scheme. There are a lot of cool things you can do. Again, I've bracketed the hard problem of, okay, now we have 5 million denominations. We'll deal with that problem later. But first, I just want to note 2 cool things you can do with scale-free money. As soon as you start, basically, which just fall out for free when you start thinking about the problem this way. One cool thing you can do is mutual credit issuance, or sort of, to map it onto existing conceptual lingo, heterogeneous UBI. So that just means that we have two denominations of credit, right, issued by different parties. Could be different people, could be friends, could be different organizations, and those parties agree to issue each other, some probably the same for people, or proportional amount of credit per unit time. So this could be people, friend groups, companies, nations. But this allows you to build up these kind of, it allows you to build up interdependency that you don't have to measure. So measuring is kind of expensive. You can view that from the macroscopic economic perspective. You can view it from the public goods perspective. You can view it from the quantum physics perspective. Measurement is not a free thing. So we want to design economic systems which allow people to choose that they aren't going to measure stuff, but express some kind of interdependency, right? So families are communists is another way of putting this, because it would be terrible and dystopian and also just really time-consuming to exactly measure all of the resources that you're sharing in a close-knit social group, right? So we want to build systems which have the ability for people to do this kind of mutual issuance, I would argue. And if you have a bunch of mutual credit issuance going on in some network graph, it starts to look something like heterogeneous UBI, but where there's no central decision maker, where all of the decisions are pairwise. And then on top of pairwise decisions over time, you can build up this very resilient network of mutual credit relationships. The other thing you can do, or that sort of is an interesting corollary of thinking about scale-free money, is that with scale-free monetary systems, most of the issuance of money, both like of existing denominations and particularly of new denominations, is in the future. And for denominations at large scales, like countries are probably still going to issue money, right? For denominations at large scales, those denominations in a world that kind of is actually compatible with scale-free money are very competitive with each other, as in they're like competing to be used as money at a large scale. And if you have denominations which are competing to be used as money, the next question you might ask is, well, what determines whether one denomination gets chosen over another? And I would argue that if people are sort of choosing what money to use, and that choice is pretty free, then people have the ability to choose on the basis of how fair they think the distribution is. And how fair you think a distribution is, in some ways could be seen as like, well, who is being distributed that money? What was kind of the initial supply? And if you're starting a currency for some sort of large-scale institution like a state, you probably want to distribute it pretty widely, right? So you might assign some of the initial supply as like basically retroactive public goods funding for stuff that's been going on relevant to your community in the near past. And if people choose on the basis of like how fair they think these distributions are, then hopefully it creates some kind of competitive pressure for new distributions of money in order to be seen as fair, to try and like accurately, at least somewhat accurately, compensate projects which have been helpful to their community in the past. Right, okay, so let's get into the hard problem. How do we scale scale-free money? Oh, well, conveniently, I work on a project called Anoma. Right, so what is Anoma, and why is it relevant to this very theoretical question of scale-free money? Anoma, just to greatly shorten things, is a protocol stack for what we call intent-centric private coordination, and I will give you a diagram to explain that instead of trying just with concepts. But first, let me note, for the sake of terminological clarity, Anoma consists of two main components, Typhon, which handles peer-to-peer networking, mempool consensus execution engine, and Taiga, which is kind of like Taiga's like the EVM that's the closest thing, but it's more like an operating system for privacy-preserving distributed applications. When you combine Typhon plus Taiga equals Anoma. Right, okay, so here is a diagram of what's going on. So first, let me talk about this word intent-centric. So Anoma is designed as an architecture to solve two problems. The first is counterparty discovery, and the second is settlement. And settlement is the problem that you're familiar with. Settlement is what blockchains do. As in, you have a bunch of transactions and you want to order them and you want to like execute them, maybe store some data, although I would argue that part's could be kind of auxiliary. And then you care about reading the execution results afterwards. And in particular, settlement happens when you have parties who already basically, in order to do settlement, must know what it is that you want to settle. So if there are multiple parties involved in a transaction, those parties need to know who they are, they need to have crafted that transaction, they need to have agreed on its contents, then they can settle it. Settlement is kind of the easy part. And the hard part in these systems is counterparty discovery. So counterparty discovery is the part, basically our word for everything which has to happen in order for these parties to find each other. So usually the advantage of using a kind of like programmatic distributed system for multi-party interactions is that you can do some amount of automated counterparty discovery. So we could have like a world where all counterparty discovery is done by like texting people on Signal. And that's not a bad method, but it doesn't scale, right? So we want to be able to find often counterparties on the basis not of who they are, but what it is that they can do, right? Counterparties who have some particular asset that we want, counterparties who are, in sort of overlapping trust circles, stuff like this, right? So Anoma tries to solve programmatically counterparty discovery and settlement, and it tries to do so privately. So let me walk through just a little bit of the data flow of how this works. So we start with a user, and we say the user has a preference, and I think this is a very safe assumption to make because if a user didn't have a preference, they would have no reason to interact with the system, right? User wants something. Okay, so it creates what we call in our architecture something called an intent. And an intent is like a generalized form of an off-chain signed message that describes what it is that the user wants. It could say like they want to swap A for B, or they have some more complex preferences. They're looking for a potato, which is in fact blue russet, in which they can pick up within 50 miles of Oregon, right? Okay, user has a preference. They send that intent around in what we call the intent gossip network. And the intent gossip network is doing, there's some kind of, should be a circular arrow here. The intent gossip network is trying to match. So it's sending around these intents all in kind of this sparse gossip, so not everyone gets all of them, but everyone gets some of them. And solvers are looking for two intents which can be matched. Matching is possible both in partial and full. So in full matching, you have Alice wants to trade X for Y, Bob wants to trade Y for X. Their intents can be directly matched. Now you have a balanced transaction which can be settled. But even if Alice wants to trade X for Y and Bob wants to trade Y for Z, that's not yet a final transaction, but it is simplifiable, right? And Anoma is designed to support this kind of partial settlement, which we think is essential to scaling these sort of complex off-chain counterparty discovery interactions. Right, so then let's assume that solving has worked. You have some kind of transaction that gets sent to the more typical mempool consensus executor, and then you have something which you can read back afterwards. So how is this relevant for Scalefree Money? What do we need to do in order to implement Scalefree Money? To, again, simplify things somewhat, we need to support issuance exchange. We need to support cycle clearing. Cycle clearing is how you deal with counterparties who don't directly have trust relations. So like Alice, Bob, Charlie. Alice and Bob know each other. Bob and Charlie know each other. Alice wants to pay Charlie, but Alice and Charlie don't accept each other's credit or whatever. In order to scale, you need to be able to use these larger paths in the graph to settle, so such that in this case, Martin, I guess, gave the great presentation on circles earlier, basically the same thing is happening. Taiga is the part of Anoma's architecture that handles issuance, exchange, cycle clearing, and mutual credit. Taiga provides full privacy for everything but solvers, as in not your identity, but the fact that you want to trade A for B or B for C is visible to the solver who's matching the intents. But you could, if that's, you can kind of forward liquidity along the trust graph, so maybe it doesn't matter so much. But if you want solver privacy, you can also add TEE or simple MVCs just for that part, and then settle with CKPs later, which probably always makes sense. Gossip, settlement, and state synchronization can be handled with Typhon. And in particular, Typhon provides something that we've started to call Scalefree Consensus. And let me explain what that means. So Anoma is, one way Anoma is kind of different than other blockchain systems is that it is designed to leave the trust graph as a free parameter. So architecturally, often systems start by making some trust assumptions. Like they say, okay, we're going to have a validator set and it'll be big, but you have to trust a quorum of that validator set. And there's one validator set, basically, right? Or they say that, okay, we're going to have these parties and you have to, we'll start there. Or even in the peer-to-peer layer, they say that, oh, well, we're going to assume that we have such and such trust model and either it works or it doesn't. It's kind of atomic. And users who are using these systems have to atomically take or leave this one trust model. In practice, most blockchains have other more practical problems that are more of a security risk than their trust models failing, like their software has bugs. But on the other hand, this does, we think this does come with consequences. Not only that users have to exactly agree, but also that basically protocols and trust models are tightly coupled, and users, when they switch between protocols, also switch between trust models and tend to associate them with each other, which is not necessary from the technical perspective. So Anoma runs through the whole protocol stack, which is kind of annoying and takes a long time to actually build, but runs this concept of heterogeneous trust, where the trust graph, as in what assumptions users want to make, is a free parameter and is even assumed to be dynamically changing. And where users are making sufficiently compatible trust assumptions, particularly for settlement, they can interact, and where they're not, they can't. So Anoma provides this using something we call scale-free consensus. And scale-free consensus doesn't mean sort of magically scaling. What it does mean is that you could also call it scale invariant, maybe sort of more, slightly more technically accurate. But scale-free consensus is based on a compositional identity abstraction. So a compositional identity abstraction means that the protocol deals with identity in a way which is compositional and independent. It's the protocol deals with identity from the perspective only of an observer. So there's some internal logic for each identity as to how signatures are produced, how messages are decrypted. Typically, that's based on knowledge of private information, such as a private key. But to the rest of the protocol stack, We only care about verifying that. We only care about knowing how to encrypt things to an identity, and we only care about knowing how to check signatures, basically check that an identity sent a message. And this abstraction in Anoma is compositional. So if I know like two people, Alice and Bob, I can create Alice and the identity Alice and Bob, from which messages can only be sent by both of them agreeing, or I can create Alice or Bob from which either one could send a message. And this kind of composition just generalizes, so you can use it to express thresholds and quorums. You can even use it to express the results of running a consensus algorithm, which is typically what a blockchain is doing. And users can reason about this kind of like consensus of consensus. So you can have users who are looking at the system and trying to decide whether or not they trust an output can use their own trust graph to make that decision. And they don't have to agree with everyone else or with anyone else on their exact trust graph. They only need to agree on enough for particular interactions. And everything is built on top of, in Anoma, this compositional identity. So this means, for example, that like something like IBC. So IBC is a protocol for messaging between blockchains, right? And IBC is designed on top of blockchains. So in IBC, on top of consensus systems. And in IBC systems, IBC-based systems like Cosmos, there are sort of two classes of identities. There are user accounts, which is one class of identities. And user accounts, send messages, they send transactions, they have like private information. And then there are blockchains, and blockchains are like a different class of identities. And blockchains send messages, and they have some, private keys split amongst validators, right? And these two, classes of identities in Cosmos, current Cosmos systems, are treated as like categorically different things, but there's actually a lot of duplicate logic. And if you build your protocol stack on top of a compositional identity abstraction, you like completely get rid of this duplicate logic. There's just the only thing you care about in order to interact with an identity is knowing how to verify messages and how to encrypt data to it. And this, generalizes across kind of arbitrary compositions starting from atomic units. Yeah, so if you view, everything as turtles, it's just like consensus all the way down. And in particular, we think that this is probably even, I would go as far as to say, a necessary prerequisite for Scalefree Money, because it sort of inverts the typical logic. So I think what we want to do in consensus systems is take like the data that matters for determining who users trust, who it's reasonable to trust, is like the application data, right? It's the data of actual interactions in the economic system, which reflect real economic interdependency. And this data has to somehow flow through the protocol stack to get to like consensus, so we can figure out who we should be using to run consensus, right? And who I should be trusting. And if you build a system with this kind of heterogeneous scale-free identity, heterogeneous trust throughout, you get the ability to do this, but only if you like keep it as a free parameter throughout all of the layers of the protocol stack. So user interactions in this architecture determine what quorums are desired and required to settle transactions. And those quorums can see like, it's more like blockchains on demand, basically. So users just have intents when they interact with the system. They have trust preferences, and according to what, basically what intents are on the network, people who they trust can figure out that they can like produce a block and claim some small fee on demand. And there's no need to run a blockchain if nobody wants it. Currently we live in this like what I call the world of supply-side blockchain economics, where we start with the blockchain, and like the blockchain's got a lot of money, right? And then try to attract a bunch of users, right? And users are faced with this like kind of alien decision of what blockchain do I want to use? Like, who cares? It's a data structure. Users, we think, have trust preferences. And what blockchains you need are basically an emergent property of like the graph of actual application interactions, which in Scalefree Money are sort of who you're sending credit around to, which kinds of mutual credit relationships you're creating, et cetera. And this graph is really dynamic. So chains may not be or need to be long-running things. Also, the great advantage of kind of building for heterogeneous trust is it allows you to like only pay for as much fault tolerance as you need. It's many times users are interacting with counterparties who they have a lot of trust with, right? And they don't necessarily need like, I don't really think my friends are going to double spend me when we're like splitting a bill. I'm willing to take that risk. And if I'm willing to take that risk, 90% of the time, like 10% of the time, I need a big consensus set. I need like, American blockchain consensus or whatever. But most of the time, I don't. And if when I don't have to pay for it, but I can still be compatible with like later settlement on this larger system, it greatly reduces the cost and thus increases the feasibility of these kinds of heterogeneous credit systems, which do need to do a lot of computation. So yeah, what I want to impress upon you about this architecture and why we've designed it this way is to allow consensus to follow trust. Basically, to allow the decisions about which consensus instances we actually run, which blockchains we actually instantiate, to follow, to be informed by the user decisions about what economic interactions they want to engage in, and not require users to choose this before, users should only need to do what it is that they actually want to do, right? And it's the job of the system to kind of run that data through in the appropriate way in order to do the more technical parts. So the other thing I want to impress upon you, and the reason why I think scale-free money is sort of a concept worth exploring. Actually, the other thing I should say is, so Martin gave this great presentation earlier on circles. The relationship between something like circles and something like Anoma is that Anoma is a general architecture which is trying to solve the architectural problems, but not trying to make specific decisions. So circles make some specific economic decisions, like one circuit A. They make some decisions about how they architect groups. They make some decisions about how, the like specific decisions which are kind of tailored to the community context which they're operating in. And I don't think it makes sense to we come from the architectural perspective of wanting to solve problems like privacy for projects like circles, and wanting to solve the problem of sort of scale-free, sort of heterogeneous trust consensus for projects like circles. We don't want to make the specific decisions. We want to build the kind of flexible architecture and let all these independent communities, experiment with different specific parameters which make sense, in their contexts. So, I think if we can, what I want to impress upon you is just that we need to stay committed as an ecosystem to replacing fiat currency. That is the real thing. Blockchain assets or blockchain or cryptocurrencies have been unfortunately misconstrued as an asset class, as if they were like some thing that you could invest in, like startups. This has bad consequences for our interfacing with the rest of the world, but it's also not interesting because if cryptocurrencies are like a new asset class for investing, I'm like a technology developer and it's nice that I get to have money and do interesting things, but I don't actually think we need more of that. I think we need like a different macroscopic accounting system, and we should be taking that problem seriously. Yeah, and then our world could look like this, really. Wouldn't be so gray. Right, but in particular, what I think scale-free money offers as an accounting system is it offers the ability to account for variety or pluralistic values. Denominations of money express values. And if we use an economic system which basically uses like 10 denominations of money, or one, depending on the Zoom level you look at it with, we won't get variety. If we want variety in our world, we need variety in our accounting system. And I think there are this is one direction at least towards that end. Thank you.